Hello everyone, I'll be presenting the concept of the frenzied warband as a Odinic cult today from a comparative perspective. I'm afraid I'll have to put any rumours spread by Hilbert here that I will be doing a spear dance to rest, so worry not, my top is staying on. Sorry to disappoint. So we start at the kind of introduction to Odin himself as a god. Odin is a very complex and multifaceted god. On the one hand, we have this kind of aristocratic, wise ruler of the Asir, someone who is known as the All-Father, leader of the Einherjar, a patron of kings, chieftains and heroes, a gift giver and wanderer. However, on the other hand, we have this cross-dressing sorcerer, a practitioner of the taboo seidr, that is a form of sorcery typically associated with women during the Viking Age, and for a man to even think about engaging on it would be a massive taboo and would mark someone out as being, I guess, almost a deviant from the community. We also have his roles as a schemer in various parts of the sagas, where he will often achieve victory through all sorts of underhanded means and deception. We have a shapeshifter, which is very key to the understanding of Odin, as well as a lord of the possessed, and the frenzied, and the patron of the berserkers, and ulfhednar, which is going to be the focus of this presentation. Or, of course, somewhere in between. These are kind of two conceptions of Odin need not even be in contradiction. It may be just a modern understanding of these concepts as being in opposition to one another. So with such a contradictory god, do we have a contradictory cult? I mean, these are all ideas which may seem in complete opposition to one another. You've got, the social outcast, yet the leader of aristocrats. So a bit of a complicated entity to understand, and the cults that would worship such a god, we don't even know what they would focus on, and what visions or kind of ideas of Odin they would choose to kind of associate it with. So we're going to be asking the questions of what was the nature of these cults and what were their practices. And it was also worth noting that very little information remains on these cults. It's essentially a process of painstaking reconstruction from various sources and comparative approaches that we can start to get an idea on what was actually done and believed. And these are quite complex processes, and we can actually reconstruct a fair bit, but to kind of put it in a more prosaic terms, we are only on the tip of the iceberg here, really. And as part of this, I'm going to focus, again, on the warband or animalistic frenzy warriors as it survives to us within the sources. So for the outline of this presentation, I'm going to cover an overview of the sources on the topic and potential methodological issues or any other things to be aware of when using them. I'm going to introduce the concept of the warband and the academic tradition that surrounds it. I will use an analysis of the etymology of Odin to argue for the association of such a god with the concept of frenzied or inspired mental activity. After this, I will compare this with depictions of berserker and ulfhednar within the Icelandic corpus to link in the kind of cultic practices as they may survive here with the concept of the god. I'll look at the wild hunt as a potential preservation within European folklore of the warband, and as, again, more cultic practice. And then I'm going to put this all into the context of additional parts of the literary corpus on the matter, notably Tacitus's Germania and other Icelandic sources, followed by a discussion of the spear dancer, which hopes to kind of weave all these strands together and present a unified conclusion on the topic. Before talking about this, however, though, we need to ask, what is a cult? As this is a term which has lots of modern associations, particularly pejorative ones, to do with concepts of charismatic leadership and heavy amounts of hierarchy and authoritarian control. What I'm going to be focusing on is something which is quite common within the classical field, which is a concept of a group which specifically chooses to focus their worship on one god from the pantheon. This usually comes to the exclusion of other gods, but this is not necessarily the case. It's more the idea of a focus, so they could very much worship other gods as part of this. It's not because you are part of an Odinic warband doesn't mean you can't worship Thor, for instance. Before I can start, I need to talk about time scale and geographical scale, because this is a comparative perspective. We're going to be looking at a longue durée understanding of history, mainly through these linguistic reconstructions that are often concepts which go right back into the Bronze Age. So it's worth addressing this kind of almost millennia-spanning understanding of the concept of the Óðinn Wodan god. I'm going to be specifically focusing on the migration period to the Viking Age with certain allusions to parts of the Bronze Age as part of the comparative perspective. The cult of Óðinn Wodan is also a widespread phenomenon across the Germanic cultural sphere, but I will be kind of focusing predominantly on the North Sea region with references at times to parts of Germany. With that done, we can now turn towards our discussion of the source base for Odinic warbands. They can be broadly split into 5 main areas. That is external contemporary literature, such as Tacitus's Germania, the medieval and Icelandic literature and the Eddic poetry preserved within. We're going to be talking about the archaeological record from the migration periods to the Viking Age. However, this is going to be less of a focus. The majority of the focus will be on the literary corpus. This is more kind of acting in a confirmatory manner. Finally, we're going to be looking at linguistic sources, something we can actually attribute some confidence to. Notably, reconstruction is a very accurate kind of methodology due to the stability of sound changes and often the stability of concepts over time. And we can point towards this kind of complex of meanings and understandings quite confidently within the history. And finally, some comparative literary evidence that may make references further afield to other Indo-European cultures. Since I'm going to be using quite a bit of contemporary external sources within this discussion, it is very much worth assessing and understanding potential problems associated with it. Particularly, Germania is something I'm focusing on quite heavily, and this has much debate within the scholarly field surrounding this. It is subject to much criticism, for instance, where Janssen here addresses the fact that it's built on the kind of ethnographic conventions within the time of writing, which was just at the height of the Roman Empire, and it is loaded with ethnographic topoi. And topoi is a concept that requires a little bit of explanation, but it's the idea of themes within classical literature or kind of descriptions that tend to get repeated over and over and over again as a means of showing that one is well-read or one well-educated, and as a part to kind of place oneself within a broader kind of literary tradition. As such, a lot of what we could even look at within the literary corpus could be older recycled topoi rather than accurate depictions of the Germanic people. So this is something to be very well aware of. Also, it's worth mentioning that other external literary sources from later on, more so in the Viking Age, for instance, Adam of Bremen's Gesta Hamburgensis, which was written at the turn of the 1st century, use Germania as a model when writing on pre-Christian belief, often employing a lot of the topoi already used within Germania. So again, worth taking a lot of care in this dimension. And we also turn towards the issues with the Icelandic corpus, as while it tells us a lot about paganism, it's also something that we very much have to tread with care when using as a source. For instance, it is comprised of 3 main groups, that is the sagas, Eddic poetry, and skaldic poetry. Notably that these are all argued to be descendants of oral tradition. Particularly Eddic and skaldic poetry are meant to be preservations of an older Germanic oral tradition. Eddic poetry is the simpler of the two, being focused more on alliterative structures, and has been argued to be subject to potentially more kind of post-Christian meddling. Though, again, very debated, and I'm not going to cover the full debates in this because I'd be here all day otherwise. Skaldic poetry is more complicated, but also tends to come from a later period than Eddic poetry. And this is mainly due to the fact that it's got lots... Yes, its complicated nature means it's very difficult to falsify and influence, and if you're wanting to apply Christian kind of changes or adaptations onto it, you'd have to be a skilled poet in yourself and have a good knowledge of kennings and the like. So with that discussion of the sources out of the way, we come to the concept of Odinic cults as ecstatic warband. This is argued by scholars in the field that the Odinic cults and worship was centered around a warband comprised of ecstatic or possessed warriors in kind of states of heightened mental activity. This is commonly called the Mennebunda within scholarship, and it argues that these warbands are comprised of animalistic warriors known in Old Norse as ulfhednar and berserker. Ulfhednar means wolf skin, and berserker means bear shirt. So it implies this concept of transformation and association with animals. Weiser has argued that the ulfhednar and berserkers reflect two different ages within the warband, where the ulfhednar are younger warriors and the berserker are initiators / lifelong kind of devotees to the warband, or kind of aged, more mature warriors. This is a concept that we will return to later. Kind of warband has been linked in the mythic corpus to the Einherja that Odin leads, as attested to with the Icelandic corpus. There is a bit of debate as to whether this is simply a paradigmatic relationship, i.e. the myths are just a reflection of a reality, or whether there was more kind of a deeper relationship between the two, where Schott argues that, that these warbands would have a special relationship with Odin, and as such ensure smooth passage into Valhalla and the Hall of the Slain and part of the kind of the Einherja who are fated to fight the serpent at the end of the world. And the argument is that initiation rituals were key to the warband, and these warriors would often devote themselves through these various rituals, and this is something we'll come back to later. And it's part of a wider Indo-European tradition of warbands comprised of animalistic warriors, with the Greek Korios or Indian Vratus being examples of this, usually to do with imagery of wolves or dogs. So that's the general idea of the warband laid out. We can now turn towards the primary piece of, well, not primary, the first piece of evidence that we have when analysing the potential existence of this. The first is that I will argue that Odin is fundamentally associated with the concept of ecstatic fury or inspired activity. This can be seen in the fact that it's a descendant of the reconstructed Proto-Germanic Wardanners. And you can see here that this is actually part of a large kind of linguistic complex of associated terms, notably the more ancient ancestor of it, the Wat in the Proto-Indo-European, which means raging, mad, or inspired. And then you have various Germanic descendants of it, which again address this concept of possession, frenzy, and madness. Interestingly, something to note, and something we'll come back to later, is you start to see within certain Germanic traditions, notably the English and Old Norse tradition, that this starts to gain associations with poetry and song. And therefore, I'd like to posit that we have a fundamental understanding of this berserker fury or ecstatic mental state with that of poetic inspiration at the same time, which is key to understanding, I would argue, the warband. In terms of this association of Óðinn as being a descendant of Warbands, and evidence we have for the existence of Warbands as a concept, we have some contemporary evidence. A good example would be the tombstone, which has a runic inscription which reads Woduride, which is standardized here, as you can see with the extra vowels, and it translates as furious or insane rider. It's in the dative form on the stone. If you put it into the nominative case, you'd have a palatal R at the end of it, so it'd be Woduridaj. This note that it has the Wodu element at the start, which is a carved attestation to the fact that there was a Proto-Germanic word associated with insanity and rage that does exist. It's also worth noting that recently, I'm not sure if you've been paying attention to the news, but there has been a new find of a bracteate containing the name of Odin, which is pushing back the date quite a bit, and it actually contains a version of Wodan. So we're actually starting to see attestations of the very words that we've reconstructed. We also have a bit later, and to show the kind of survival of this seemingly ancient concept of Odin with fury, possession, and all these ideas in Adam of Bremen's Gestur Hamburgensis, where he says, Wodan is der furor, so Wodan, that is madness. So we definitely have, even going into the turn of the turn of the first millennium, that madness is very much associated with Wodan. It's also worth noting here that, so we have Odin as this dual kind of figure associated both with poetic inspiration and martial frenzy or fury, but we also have the association of him specifically being the leader of people so associated with this fury. One of the Ordin's Heiti, which is basically one of the many names associated with Odin as attested to by the Icelandic corpus and many kennings, is, so one of them is Herjan, which means leader of the Her, and Her broadly translates to kind of military force or warband, which is key. So we already have this association with him as being a leader of a military force. This is a descendant of the reconstructed Proto-Germanic Harjanar, which has this na suffix, which in Proto-Germanic usually denotes a leader or master of a group. This is also related to the Proto-Indo-European no suffix, which performs a similar role. From this, we can infer that Warbands means leader or master of the possessed or inspired. So again, we have already an association between military force and Odin's role as leader of it, but also Odin's role as leader of the inspired, ecstatic, and insane. So there's very much already wrapped up within the linguistic kind of corpus that we can draw from. In terms of reinforcing this concept of Odin as leader of kind of the inspired and the possessed, we have his we have an attestation in the Icelandic corpus in the Mead of Poetry to his association with poetic inspiration and this kind of, again, this divine ecstatic state, where the Mead of Poetry is portrayed to be the origin of the skill of poetry, where Odin's flight from the giants in eagle form and the spilling of mead across the world is cited for the reason that man possesses this ability to create poetry, i.e. Odin is the origin of the necessary inspiration for poetry. Many kennings allude to this, such as, excuse my Old Norse pronunciation, I'm sure there are many in the room who do a better job than I will, but many kennings allude to this, notably the Heilagt full Hrafen Osir, which is the Raven God's holy drink. And yes, we got some... And so we've now kind of fundamentally linked Odin to this concept of both fury, inspiration, and kind of poetic inspiration. Shows that we can posit it's two sides of the same coin, where martial fury is very much associated with poetic inspiration and this kind of heightened state of being. And we now come towards more evidence for Odin's role as a leader of those with this heightened state of being, which is the classic passage cited from Ynglinga Saga, which clearly points towards Odin's men going into battle as being mad, like dogs or wolves. Also notice the kind of dogs, wolves, and bears, which are very much animals associated with the berserkers and ulfhednar. If you remember, their names very much just kind of put them into the context of this animal, and this is also a concept we will return to later. Also notice the description of berserker fury or berserkergangar, as it's put in the corpus. We also have skaldic poetry, which refers to this, where you have Thorbjorn Hornkloffi's Haraldskvaði, with berserkir grenjuðu gudurvas þeim og sínum, ulfhednar emjuðu og duðu í sörn, which basically again shows this association with these warriors with that of fury, insanity, and ecstatic states. Also note that it mentions the wolfskins shrieking and shaking their weapons, which may actually be a description of the spear dance, as the concept we'll return to later, although this is kind of a bit speculative at this point. So we can definitely point towards the Óðinn Wodan kind of god as being fundamentally tied to that of poetic inspiration, madness, and fury, and these being bound up in the same concept. This is also a term of considerable antiquity, and associations of these concepts going back well into kind of reconstructed Proto-Indo-European, And we also see associations of this with soothsayers, seers, and prophets, notably the Old Irish faith and the Latin facets. This association, again, with poetry and trance is key, notably that poetry in pre-literate societies was fundamentally associated with knowledge, hence the reference to the Old Irish faith and facets as soothsayers, seers, or prophets, or poets, particularly facets, because in the classical kind of corpus, a lot of seers or oracles are described as speaking in poetic meter. It's also worth saying that poetry in pre-literate societies was associated with knowledge because of the fact that it would tend to be more stable than other forms of oral traditions, and as such would survive the decades and centuries better than other forms, and was one of the key ways in which knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. So we have this association of this kind of divine-given fury, which is also associated with knowledge. And this is something that I will argue is creating this kind of divine origin for knowledge and this entry into this kind of liminal space of another world which comes as part of this, where you have to kind of enter this ecstatic state to receive knowledge from Odin, the knowledge gatherer. So with this argument for this kind of dual-sided poetic kind of fury part of this ecstatic state of being, I'll now turn towards other potential evidence for the frenzied warband, and through this I'll be looking at the wild hunt, which is argued to be a folkloric preservation of the activities of Männerbunde, or their kind of mythic counterparts, part of the Einherjar. Notably, if you look in kind of Germany, it's referred to as das, again, pardon my pronunciation, I'm English, I don't know how to pronounce anything, das Wütendes Heer and die wilde Jagd, Switzerland's Wutes Heer and Gutes Heer. Also know that Wütendes and Wutes, are actually descendants of the Germanic concept of Wurth, that is, fury, divine inspiration, and all of these associations that come with it. In Scandinavia, it's a bit more closely tied towards the role of Odin and the kind of the gods being associated with it, in terms of Óðinsjakt and Óskarai, which is a corruption of the Old Norse Asgardsreið, i.e. the ride of Asgard. In England, it's simply referred to as the hunt, and we also have, interestingly, an example of a similar kind of folkloric tradition in France, where it is referred to as le menu et le quin, or le chasse et le quin, which we think is associated with the carnival. So we now turn towards descriptions of the wild hunt, and we can start to analyze this as being potentially a preservation of Odinic cults. Firstly, we see that it describes this kind of chaotic procession which travels across the sky, which already brings to mind, also in light of lots of descriptions of it being a furious host or a furious army, of this kind of ecstatic warriors in a group. Notably that the Wütendes Heer variants, the variants which describe it as the host, will often include descriptions of armed men fighting one another as part of the procession, which is argued to be a reflection of the Einherjar. A common feature of the of the wild hunt is a description of hounds or wolves or werewolves, which is interesting because if you remember what I said earlier, a lot of the associations of the berserkers are with wolves, and also within the wider Indo-European field surrounding that of the warband, the concept of the wolf warrior is very much one which spans this geographical area. It's also worth noting that these animals are very often associated with death, and roles as either psychopomps, i.e. beings which guide people to the afterlife, or just general associations with the underworld, with Kerberos being the kind of the clearest example of that. And we also have the descriptions of 2, 3, 6, and 8-legged demonic horses, which instantly brings to mind concepts of Sleipnir, Odin's horse in which he would ride into the underworld. Again, we have associations with death and concepts of the psychopomp. We have figures with fiery eyes, which again may be a reference to Odin, who was described as having a baleful gaze in which he would freeze people or paralyze people under. Lastly, we have men dressed in black, often with kind of black painted faces or bodies, which is also quite important. We now turn towards our interpretations of these warbands, of the Wild Hunt, where the black painted men are considered to be elements of masked ancestor cults, which is tied to Óðinn's associations with the dead. It's notable that particularly Kershaw, who argues this, draws upon the work of Carl Muley, a Swiss folklorist, who argues that masked cults are always associated with ancestor cults, and he draws on a wide array of ethnographic examples from this, notably from Africa with the Maasai tribe. So they very much argue this as being the case, and you actually see that the festivals associated with the Wild Hunt, and in that it usually arrived around these festivals, that is the Carnival and Yuletide, had mass traditions. I mean, the Carnival's infamously got of all these kind of elaborate and kind of over-the-top masks, and has been argued convincingly to be an ancestor cult, or people believe themselves to be possessed by ancestors. And elements of Yuletide, again, have been argued to be preservations of this kind of older ancestor cult where men would dress up and literally believe themselves to be possessed by the ancestors, and they'd go around knocking on doors of people, asking to be fed and given drink, and in return they would bring fertility to the surrounding regions, and this is for this reason the Wild Hunt was often anticipated greatly by the people who believed in it. Also note that they would often ask for food and drink, as this is a concept I will return to later when talking about berserkers. And as I mentioned before, hounds, wolves and werewolves are tied to the ulfhednar, as well as their fundamental association within Indo-European cultures and that of death. And finally, we have Odin as the Death Rider on Sleipnir, and it's also worth noting that Odin would often ride Sleipnir into the underworld to talk to the dead and get knowledge from them. As such, we have an association with death being fundamentally part of the Wild Hunt, and as such we can draw this to be potentially being associated with these ecstatic warbands, as well as concepts of knowledge and the animistic or kind of animalistic parts of this cult, which were tied up with this kind of nexus of death and knowledge. So it's interesting to note all these features appear within these Wild Hunt legends that survive in Europe. So with the Wild Hunt so analysed as being a potential preservation, we now turn towards the literary sources as being potentially supporting parts of these interpretations, as well as just wider understandings of this. The most commonly turned to kind of account of this is Tacitus's Germania, in which I've already addressed its issues and drawbacks. There are three key passages which are commonly cited here as being evidence of ecstatic warband cults within the Iron Age, and I will compare these with descriptions of berserker in the Icelandic corpus, notably from Ynglinga Saga, Erbegja Saga, Galtrex Saga, and a poem by Torbjorn Hornklofis about the Battle of Hafrsfjord. So the first of these sources says that the Ari or Hari, fierce beyond the superiority of the strength they possess over the other just enumerated people, improve the natural ferocity of aspect by artificial helps. Notably, their shields are black, their bodies painted, they choose the darkest nights for an attack. And Tacitus very much focuses upon the psychological elements of this, but again, we're talking from a Roman perspective. But it is worth noting that we have a name here for this tribe that he's describing, which is etymologically associated with her, that is a warband or military force. And as such, we can point towards there being, at least within Tacitus's understanding of it, groups of warriors or a tribe who would paint themselves black. And we could argue that this is the kind of ancestral kind of cults that we see preserved within the Wild Hunt, and the descriptions of black painted men within the Wild Hunt being reflected within this classical source. We also point towards another extract from Germania, which talks about the Kaye, and notably talks about individuals of a more daring spirit from the rest, who, from the time they arrive at years of maturity, they let their hair and beard grow and do not divest themselves of this votive badge. It is worth mentioning that Tacitus very much recognizes this as a votive part, and it has been argued that the act of growing out this hair would be a mark of initiation, notably the fact that it talks about arriving at this from years of maturity. So it's very much when one enters adulthood, they would have to start growing their hair out and only be able to kill someone, only be able to cut it after they'd killed someone. And it's argued that this growing of the hair out would mark symbolic devotion to a god. And this is very much supported in the Icelandic corpus, where berserkers are commonly described as being unkempt and ugly in appearance, which would possibly kind of imply this idea of long kind of unkempt hair and not being able to cut, bathe or wash. We also have the concept of a vow or refusal to bathe one's hair, which is found within the corpus. Notably, Harold Fairhair, who vows never shall his hair be cut or combed till he's made all Norway his own when trying to win Gyda's hand in marriage. So we very much have the concept, at least within the Icelandic corpus, of hair being grown out as part of a vow. We also have descriptions of this within the classical sources, notably Civilis' revolt, where he leads the Batavi against Rome, where he vows not to cut his hair until he has defeated the Roman legions. So this is very much a common trend you see within Germanic cultures, of this vow being made to divine beings and being symbolically represented by growing one's hair out, and devotion towards it. And it's also notable that berserker are posited to be kind of mature, lifelong warriors. And since they're always of this unkempt appearance, would have devoted themselves by growing their hair out and not washing or whatever, to be devoted for life to these gods. And this is a concept we'll return to later. And it is also worth noting that growing one's hair out would enhance their animalistic kind of appearance, which is very much, again, part of associations with the berserker, ulfhednar, and what we've seen in the Wild Hunt. We finally turn towards the last of the kind of Germania, second to last of the Germania extracts, which again continues about the Kaye, where it talks about some growing aged under this mark, conspicuous to both foes and friends, and they would be at the front line of engagements, which is also key, because again, since we've talked about berserkir being these older warriors, and we have descriptions of them growing hoary under the mark, i.e. age, these would be kind of elite warriors who devote themselves for life to Odin and for life to the warband, whereas ulfhednar may have been more of a kind of temporary arrangement. And we kind of point towards potential initiation rituals into adulthood, again, a concept I will return to when looking at Germania further. It's also worth noting that these are described as having no house, land, or domestic cares at all, and they're maintained by whomsoever they visit. If you remember, I talked about the Yuletide maskers, usually knocking on people's door and asking for food as part of their possession by the ancestors, possibly illustrating this kind of relationship between these elite devotionary warriors and the fact they were not able to maintain themselves and were reliant on the communities they fought for. And we can link this to Starkadr as the archetypal berserker within Icelandic literature. Notably, that when he is being judged by Thor and Odin in Gjaltrek's saga, he is subject to the curses by Thor, but Odin appears to kind of provide gifts in counterbalance to this. And note that Thor says that Starkadr, who is described as being a berserker within Gjaltrek's saga, shall never have land nor estates, but Odin gives him great riches in return, which have again been part of this possible relationship between that of these warriors and the lords that would support them, or the communities that would support them. Also, Odin talks about giving him victory in battle, very much associated again with Odin as this martial god who dispenses military victory and potentially the divine knowledge required for this victory, something we will talk about later in reference to Sigurd Fafnisbane. And Thor talks about him being wounded in every battle he fights, which may be again a reference to the fact that the berserker would forego armor as described within the Icelandic corpus and would be more prone to being wounded during battle while in the state of fury or frenzy. And also note the association of Starkather, who is very much described as a berserker, as being given the art of poetry by Odin. So again, we have berserkers entering this kind of frenzied state of fury, which is very much associated with being of a poetic kind of state of mind and being able to be a poet oneself. It is also worth noting that Starkather is always described as being incredibly ugly, so much so that people would often mistake him for a giant. And again, while this doesn't necessarily refer to him being unkempt in appearance in terms of hair and beard or whatever, it may indicate again an understanding of this. We now turn towards our final extract from Germania, which talks about the concept, at least how it's been interpreted, of a spear dance, where young men who make it their diversion dance naked amidst drawn swords and presented spears. Practice has conferred skill at this exercise, and skill is given grace. The only reward of this pastime is the pleasure of spectators, so it's not done for any form of money. And while, again, we have to understand Tacitus through his Roman lens, you could probably only think of this being an entertainment or a diversion, but this, again, has been argued to be more likely a ritual performance, or perhaps an initiation ritual. Note, you have young men being described here as doing it. It's quite specifically stated by Tacitus, and this is often the time that one would undergo initiation rituals in life. And we have lots of examples in the ethnographic corpus of people undergoing initiation rituals which are hazardous in order to become a man, i.e. from youth to a fully matured person. We actually have examples of this kind of spear dancing attested to within the archaeology. A good example is the Torslanda dye plates, where you can see a man who is seemingly of naked aspect. It's also worth mentioning that in the classical understanding of being naked, it was usually from the waist up rather than being wholly naked. Also note, we have a warrior here who is very much dressed in a kind of wolf skin, very much a clear-candid appearance, which brings to mind all of the associations with wild dogs, wolves, and werewolves that we have previously seen in descriptions of the hunt and berserkers, as well as the wider Indo-European warband. And it has been posited that these kind of horns, as they seem, upon closer inspection, are actually birds, and very much imitate the man-between bird kind of theme that you see within a lot of art. And if you want to hear more about that, Hilbert will mention this later in his presentation. But it's thought that this represents Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, that is Odin's ravens, who are fundamentally associated with knowledge again. But we also have the concept of knowledge in the context of a spear dance, which has been argued to bring about this kind of frenzied or manic state. As such, we have an initiation ritual, possibly, where you have young warriors. You know, the wolf, again, ulfhednar has been described as being the younger warriors within the kind of warband, and someone who's undergoing this kind of this spear dance. And in doing so, remember Tacitus's youthful kind of emphasis on the youth part of it, you would go into this spear dance, enter this kind of divine state of mantic fury, in which divine knowledge with numinous potential, i.e. it's otherworldly because it comes from this divine state of possession so associated with Odin and poetry and the divine nature of poetry, in which this knowledge would be imparted upon you, and through this you'd be marked out as being part of a warband. This is very much in line with Schutz's concepts of initiation and the entry into another world through either these kind of mantic states or associations with animalistic kind of beings, and associations with the dead as being part of the other world and imparters of knowledge. And after this initiation ritual, this divine knowledge would let you kind of be able to have this kind of inspired mantic state of fury at any time you needed it to be, i.e. in battle, and you'd be part of the warband. And from this point, you would grow your hair out and be devoted to the god Odin through such a ritual. We see other kind of examples of this. For instance, the Fingalsham belt buckle from Kent in England, where we see again a spear dancer, this time wholly naked, with again the two birds on top of the headdress, firmly cementing this concept of knowledge in association with the furious warrior. And in terms of further associations of this, again, we have the Sutton Hoo helmet, which clearly features dancers with spears, with, again, this bird headdress, as well as, interestingly, a riding figure. Odin's very commonly referred to as the rider god within the Icelandic corpus. Also, this kind of Odinic association of the spear dancer is firmly kind of reinforced by the Sutton Hoo helmet, where in one of the eyes, you see this kind of line of garnets here. One eye had the gold foil behind it missing, where this would produce the kind of illusion in firelight of only one of the eyes would glint in the firelight, creating the illusion of being one-eyed. And one of the key associations of Odin is his sacrifice of his eye for knowledge. Again, so again points towards this one fundamentally being an Odinic piece of art, and secondly, the concept of Odin being fundamentally associated with knowledge. It's also worth noting that if you see the kind of animal part on this part of the helmet, the garnets in the animal eyes also have the same one-eyed effect on them. So it's very much going for a lot of Odinic imagery. So we now come to the conclusions of this, where we can confidently point towards the existence of a frenzied warband through all these kind of fragmentary pieces of information we can kind of start to reconstruct into a picture. That happened in the migration period, at least both within the archaeological corpus, the linguistic frameworks that surrounding it, and as well the literary sources that we have both from antiquity and the medieval period. Such a devotion would be manifested through a variety of means, notably, as I said, the symbolic refusal to cut one's hair, in which they mark themselves out as being devoted to a god, which would probably come after this initiation ritual, in which one gained access to divine inspiration through ecstatic states, and this secret knowledge came from the other world. We actually have parallels of this concept of divine knowledge well within the Icelandic corpus. An example would be Sigurd Fafnisbane, who is a chosen warrior of Odin, and after eating the heart of the dragon Fafnir, after he kills him, he is able to listen to birds. And if you saw a lot of the previous bird imagery associated with knowledge, this again may be an Odinic parallel within the corpus. A key part of the achieving of one's kind of power as a ruler, or as one's fate, would be the acquisition of secret or divine knowledge, which my colleague Petter will allude to in his presentation. And it's also, I'm going to kind of leave you on potentially a link to further studies in this, where recent trends in archaeology have pointed towards the rise of an Odinic hall-based cult. Do we potentially see the morphing of this warband cult into one that is institutionalized and formed around the hall and the lord? Notably that within the corpus, berserkers are often described as being a key part of lord's forces or parts of their retinue, and being assigned within the hall and provided for within the hall. And it may be that these lifelong warriors, the bear shirts, were a fundamental part of the institution of power associated with this new rising rising class of lords and chieftains. Again, something that my colleague Petter will cover is the rise of this class. I'd like to kind of leave you with this concept of the mantic fury being fundamentally associated with knowledge and divine knowledge and poetic inspiration. And we now have my bibliography for any of those who are interested. I'll leave that up quickly. And any questions?
Well, was amazing. Let's give him a round of applause.
Yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. I specifically found the Torslunda die plates interesting. I was wondering, what is the archaeological context of those?
So the die plates are argued to be the plates that were fashioned to create the helmets in the style of Sutton Hoo, and the Vendel period helmets, which also have similar designs, and they were fashioned from bronze. I can't remember what the exact fine context was off the top of my head, but it was very much a kind of production process for the helmets that you see in the Vendel period and the style of Sutton Hoo, which often feature this Odinic imagery of spear dancers and one eyes and all this stuff. Yes, at the back.
I'm particularly interested in the correspondence between Northern poetry and these military forces. It's pretty new to me, but in this kind of cult, military-based cult, can we still talk about a mysterious cult?
I mean, this is something which is described as very much, within the scholarship, this mystery cult is described as being very much the nature of this, and initiations being key to entering it. So it very much was the idea of kind of secret or divine knowledge. And one of the key parts within the Icelandic kind of corpus, as I was saying, is secret knowledge is a fundamental association with Odin, and a lot of these warbands would often be quite small and restrictive, possibly. Again, it's pointing at something. We can't say anything for certain, but there certainly was a mysterious aspect that you can point towards being quite common in lots of these style of organizations.
If there are no other questions, can I quickly sneak in and ask one of my own, which is that at the end you allude to the fact that, you started off by saying Odin is somewhat contradictory, that there are many facets to him as a god that we understand from poetry and the archaeological sources. So Odin is seen as somewhat of a king of gods. He's a god of the aristocracy, he's a god of the lord. But a lot of the evidence here suggests he's a lord of warriors in that way, especially warriors that are connected with animalistic instinct. And there are some contradictions within that. Do you think that it remains the same, the cult of Odin? So if Tacitus is onto something and he's writing about the Germanic peoples around the 1st century, do you think that it's a very similar cult to the one we see in the Viking Age, or do you think there is change that goes on there?
I mean, as I suggested at the end, if you place it within the context of the archaeology, looking at the kind of the rise of the aristocracy from the migration period into the Viking Age, you also see an institutionalization of religion. And it may be that these warbands, which as elite military forces would have formed the basis of power for this aristocracy, being institutionalized alongside it, and being very much drawn into the fold of a lord's retinue. As I said before, berserkers were often attributed special status within courts, and this is something which may point towards this being kind of drawn into a kind of wider potential aristocratic cult of Odin as being an element of it, but not necessarily the case. And this cult may have been appropriated and then molded to suit the ideological needs of the aristocrats, or may even represent just the changing situations on the ground. I mean, as ever, when it comes to myth, religion, and cultic practice, it's this complex interplay between ideologies affecting the beliefs and the beliefs in turn affecting ideology.
Are there any more questions?
You talked about ugliness described as a descriptor of berserkers. There's also troll used in tandem with ugliness. In research, do you find anything that has to do with connecting trolls with the hair directly?
I haven't actually come across that, no. So potentially requires further research.
Something for the next conference.
I mean, it could be one parallel there. The Sami people are quite often referred to as trolls as well in Old Norse literature. And for example, Grim in the Ravnishaman saga, he gets a side of his face is bearded from a young age because of the vice of a Sami or a troll
Right.
falling on him while he's conceived. So I mean, maybe a parallel with the hair there as well.
Interesting.
Something interesting to look into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely something to look at. And at the back there, I saw.
Right, this might be common knowledge for most of you, but what's the deal with growing out your hair? Because I don't get why you would connect growing out your hair with the devotion to God.
So if you remember earlier, I made reference to it being quite common to make oaths based on the growing out of one's hair, and this would usually be done in the presence of a god. I mean, I didn't actually include that part of Harold's oath, but he very, very clearly alludes to the god of, to a god when making this oath. So we can usually tie it towards this kind of, again, this divine entity, kind of divine devotion as part of it.
Yeah, a little point on that. Now in modern times, we are very fan of thinking of Vikings as these long-haired, long-bearded chumps, and then seeing people swearing to never cut their hair or beard sounds kind of not like a big deal. In a society we think of as filled with chumps with long hairs and long beards, but that isn't the case. We see in iconography from the Viking Age that they very often had quite kept hair, short hair, often very short beards as well. Big moustaches were a big thing, and short beards, we see this change a little bit, but allowing your beard and hair to really grow out for a long time would really set you apart from all the other people around you. I wouldn't say it would be exactly like this, but it would be kind of like doing that in like the 90s or something like that, when beards was really uncommon.
All right, we've got 2 questions here.
Yeah, mine's kind of like in addition to that, because if I remember correctly, even Fadlan also pays that as like special attention to that one. Like he observes the Vikings during his travels, which I think was down in Istanbul, when he's like encountered them, and kind of notes how the special feature, like how they kept the long hair, like how well kept it was made, along with like all the features, kind of almost a feminine degree, like we're making and things like that. So it seems to be like entire part of the very distinct aesthetic of a northern war, like a northern warband, to have that long hair, because he's made special mention of it.
That might also be supported by, we find a lot of the time, combs.
Yeah.
Right? So for men and for women. So and small ones for beards, but I think your point stands very much that appearance was very important, and I don't think now we sort of think, I'm going to grow a mustache for fun, but I think back then maybe it's more symbolic meaning. Andre, did you have a question? Then I'm afraid we'll move on. We can have more discussions in the break, but especially in the pub after we're finished. If you have more questions, don't worry, we will get around to it. But Andre, please.
The last one is really fast, and it's more on the kind of mythos side. Do you see any kind of convergence, or should I say similarities, between the berserkers or the wolfskin and what has become known as a zealot? This mythos kind of what you created as a mythos for fanatical church warrior that wants to impose the rule of their god or whatever that one true god is in most likely being a very brutal way.
It's an interesting idea. I'm sure you could probably point to some interesting studies in religion to do with divinity, elevated states of being, and potentially kind of violent states of being in devotion to your religion. An interesting concept. But we do see across a lot of, particularly Indo-European cultures, this concept of a furious warrior. So or kind of an animalistic warrior. I mean, a good example is even in Rome, you have the legions, the men on the front line would be wearing wolf skins. So it's quite interesting.
Hey, that was excellent. Thank you very much, Tom. That was awesome.
Thanks.